That's right. It does still cool down. But yeah, we're in starting to warm up. Had a nice storm the other night that cooled it off. Was it yesterday? Yesterday was pretty cool, or the day before, Monday?
Monday.
It's pretty cool outside. But yeah, so a couple things. Restrooms are, if you're not familiar, they're just kind of walk to the left there, and then you'll do kind of a loop around. You'll see them. There's a water fountain just past these glass panels here for the restroom. So I think what I'm going to do, you can see the slide, is, we kind of talked a little bit about rebranding in previous months, the past couple months. AZ Spug versus Phoenix Office 365 user group versus calling ourselves something different, or the Microsoft user group, or whatever. So I think what we're going to land on is just something along the lines of just Phoenix 365. It's short, it's easy to remember. If you're a social person out there on Twitter, socializing this stuff, it's a short hashtag, easy to, and it's somewhat fairly unique, and it represents Phoenix because we are the city of Phoenix, not the whole state of Arizona. And that logo that you see at the top there is an old logo. When I moved out here in 2014, I started up the Phoenix Office 365 user group because I was thinking bigger than SharePoint then. My day-to-day job was bigger than SharePoint then. So I'll probably try to tweak that logo a little bit and pull the word office out of there or something, okay? Or just change it to PHX 365 under our skyline. Something simple. So today, a couple topics, and can you folks that are online, can you guys hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Loud and clear. And you guys can hear him when he spoke, right?
Yep.
I was in here early today and I messed around with the settings. So as we speak, the microphone's right here, this Jabra puck that I have. So if you guys have questions, you can come up and speak into it, or I'll do my best to repeat just in case we need to do that. But it tends to pick things up pretty well. And then I've got the audio output through our little screen friend to my left here, just outputting the mic. It's my speaker, right? It's the speaker for our session, which is pretty slick. So it's working out well. This is a great space. It's one of my favorite rooms to present in ever because it is just so easy to use, and there's lots of room and everything that we need. So today, migrating to SharePoint Online and what's new in SharePoint 2019. Those are our two main topics. We'll see how long they take. The plan is to have the first part of the session be on migration, and my colleague Andrew is going to present that. We'll have time to break for food, and then we'll dive into the second part. And with whatever time we have left, we'll have open discussion. We'll have Q&A. There's some other cool stuff I can show you if you're interested. So starting off quickly, I think Andrew does have a hard stop at 6:45, so I want to get him started pretty soon here. But I want to thank our sponsors. It's very important that we do this and recognize them for their assistance in what we do. Nobody's getting paid to do this, so the fact that you guys are willing to come out here and meet with me, that's pretty cool. But also that we have, Skype for Business through my organization at Catapult, along with this amazing space and the food and drink sponsorship through Drive Time. So thank you, Catapult. Thank you, Drive Time. We appreciate it greatly. And our first speaker, Andrew Huynh of Catapult Systems, a colleague of mine based in Texas somewhere. He'll explain, elaborate a little bit. He's going to do our introductory topic on migrating to SharePoint Online and some of the things that we see at Catapult with our customers and some gotchas, some best practices, things like that. I'll let him dive into that. If you need his email, I'm going to post this presentation to our LinkedIn group tomorrow or the next day, sometime between now and the next time we meet. I'm trying to do a better job about putting things out there sooner, scheduling the next agendas earlier. That way I'm not scrambling at the last minute. Okay? So we're on Meetup. I think most of you are aware of Meetup. We also have the LinkedIn group, and then the videos that I'm recording will be out on the YouTube channel. And a lot of everything we have right now is branded as AZ SharePoint Pros. So I'm going to see what I can do to transition that to the PHX 365. Okay, just for consistency. I'm going to do a presentation on what's new in SharePoint 2019 shortly after Andrew. And that's the start of mine. So with that, Andrew, if you would like to please share your screen, and then I will. You're welcome just to go ahead and get started.
Okay, well, thank you, Eric. Let me share my screen, and
And
hopefully you can hear me okay.
I am going to go on mute as well to hopefully avoid an echo for you.
Okay, no worries. All right, so hopefully everyone can see my screen here.
Hold on 1 second. And we have it now, yes. Let me biggie size it somehow. Okay, I know there's a way to do it.
Did you remove the participants and conversation stuff on the left side?
I've been working so much in Microsoft Teams, I often forget where things are. There we go. All right, take it away, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Well, thank you very much, Eric, and thank you for the Phoenix User Group for having me tonight. So I'm going to talk about the topic around SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint Online migration. I'm going to do more of an overview, and some kind of the items I'll be talking through are things that myself, as far as what I do when I work with other clients, the process that we go through for migration. So let me go through some of the agenda items I have here. So these are some of the high-level topics. I think I have a lot more slides than I meant to, but we'll see how much of this we can get through. So a few of the things we'll touch on will be around planning, execution, training, some next step, and then we have time, maybe I'll touch on a little bit around the hybrid mode. I think that was a topic that might be of interest to some folks. And then at the end, if there's time for Q&A. Okay, so this is me. My name is Andrew Huynh. So I work at Catapult along with Eric Skaggs. My title is a delivery manager. What that really entails is I work with a lot of different clients to provide delivery oversight. Previously, before that, and partially what I kind of also do is I'm also an architect around the information worker, or IW, as a practice lead for our central region, and that pretty much covers from Waco, Texas, if you know where that is, and kind of all the way up to Canada. So we have quite a few states that I work with. Just a little bit about myself. I've lived in Las Colinas, Irving, for those who may know that area. If not, then it's just Dallas. Been out there for the past 19 years. And I've been with Catapult for now almost 11 and a half years. Some of the specialties that I spend time with working, if I'm not doing my delivery manager part and more on the technology side, I spend a lot of time working with clients on discussing about Teams, SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, for example, Yammer, Flow, Power Apps, and as well as around governance as well. So there's a lot of governance components. We'll touch on that as well. Just something interesting that I like to do if I'm traveling for work or for leisure. One thing I try to do, and it's been, I don't know, something I've been doing for a few years, is see if I can hit a sporting event wherever I go. And so I've, over the years, at least for traveling for work anyway, it's easy to hit basketball, baseball, and hockey. Those are the ones that usually are available during the weekdays or so. But leisure-wise, I've gone to a few different places that has a rodeo or bullfighting, softball, or even soccer. So those are pretty fun stuff. So those are things I try to do if I go on a trip. And my wife, sometimes she'll join me for that. Most times she will. Otherwise, I'm on my own. Okay, so let me get into the first portion of my presentation around planning. So when we're talking about SharePoint, migration, the biggest thing that you have to deal with is you got to kind of have the plan. I mean, as with most things, you have to have a game plan on what you're going to execute. Just because the migration process itself there's a lot of moving parts, and so when you go into planning, there's things that you have to deal with, and so. From a high level, when we first start out, and then I'm working with a client, for example, and we're trying to understand about what we need to do next, or first even, the first thing a lot of times is we have to plan around content assessment, really understanding about what type of content is available are already existing in your environment. So I kind of put down here some of the things that you should take inventory of while you're planning out what's in your environment currently. So the things that I always look for is around, how much content do you really have? Because that's really going to drive, how much content you need to migrate. And a lot of times using your content database as a starting point is a good way to do that. And sometimes, it's you may have stuff in there that, you might need to clean up, but ideally that's a good starting point. Other things you want to also take inventory is if you have any workflows in your environment, whether designer or third-party ones like Nintex or K2 or whatever, you want to make sure that you may take account for those, because a lot of times, those are your business process that need to be migrated. And so you want to make sure you know what those are and how they work. Same thing with forms as well. A lot of folks may have InfoPath forms and third-party like Nintex forms or K2 type forms. Again, same thing with those. If they're part of your business process and tied to your workflows, you want to make sure that you inventory those and know what they are. The other things too, as well, is you want to know how many site collections you have in your environment, and to a lesser extent, how many subsites. These are things that will determine essentially how much content you're going to be dealing with. Other items are like customizations and third-party solutions. Those are important to know as well. In some cases, depending on the necessity to keep customization or even third-party solutions, is to find out whether there are compatible SharePoint Online versions or customizations, whether or not they may need to be rewritten or redeveloped to make sure it works inside of SharePoint Online. Because the biggest thing that when you're dealing with SharePoint Online is that you don't have access to a few things that you would with the on-prem version of SharePoint, namely a lot of the back-end server components or server services. Those are things that you may require some rewrites if you do have customizations that you continue or plan to still use. Then also you want to make sure about your service applications, namely around the biggest one is I would say the managed metadata. If you are using that and leveraging like the term store, that's stuff that you would probably want to make sure you inventory and determine how we're going to migrate or bring that into SharePoint Online. If you have custom branding as well, those also definitely would need to be assessed and make sure if you're going to plan to bring that branding into SharePoint Online or whatnot. So there's things around that you want to account for. And of course, there's a lot more things. I've listed a few other items here, such as content types, site columns, permissions, policies, for example. These are other things that you may capture as well. So the more information you know about what's going on in your on-prem farm, the better you're ready to at least determine how you can address that. So the last thing I have here is once you know what you have, then you'll look at those items and determine whether they need to be cleaned up, especially if it's around content, whether they should be, removed or just dropped altogether, and then possibly also remediate if you have some content or things that may need to be fixed, and those things that allow you to be identified for remediation as well. We touched on a little bit about the workflows and forms, and so if you do have a lot of workflows and forms, and I have clients where they may have a lot of that, and they need to keep those, and so determining the next step for that is important, because you want to make sure that these processes are still working once they get to SharePoint Online. So some things I have here, definitely review the forms, know how your forms are set up, same thing as your workflows. And then you want to then look at prioritizing based on maybe complexity and usage. The easier the workflow and the forms, but the high use, those are usually a good starting point to determine for migration. And then the more complex ones, you may think about how to address this later. So kind of from a migration scope around workflows and forms, can it be migrated as is, or does it need to be reworked? That's kind of the question you're dealing with. The as is the easy ones. Those are the low-hanging fruits that you can then look at. Okay, that could be part of my migration. It can be done sooner than later. Then the other thing too is since you're going to SharePoint Online, you now have different options around workflows and forms. So some of the things you may have to look at is, are you looking to possibly redevelop your workflows from like designer workflows and InfoPath forms over to possibly Flow or Power Apps? Those are available to you, and those are things that there's not an easy migration or conversion method. So they do require some thoughts about what you need to do next around that, the rework for that. And that could be something that maybe something that could be part of a separate work or a project, or possibly maybe done parallel, but something that definitely has to be addressed if especially you're looking to redesign. It's just there's not a true conversion between the existing SharePoint design, for example, and InfoPath. Now, if you look at Nintex workflows, for example, which I'm very familiar with, they do have a migration path from on-prem to the cloud, which makes it a little easier, and there's ways to get that migrated. But again, there's still some differences as well, and so some things may not fully work, and so it may still require some rework. And definitely throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, just feel free to ask. I'll make sure I'll answer what you have there. Okay, so the next item in the planning stage that I also have here is around information architecture. You want to definitely have some planning around that. The main thing around that is definitely the idea of, well, you may have a structure that worked on-prem. It could be one big site collection, and that's great. But maybe that's not really the way to go going forward, because you may have a lot of sub-sites and whatnot. And kind of part of Microsoft's recommendation over the past few years has been to kind of keep it more flat. And so there may be a thought there whether or not you need to possibly think about restructuring that content. A lot of times that that's part of what you need to do to make sure that it works well going forward. And those are things that that's part of the information architecture. I think that's very important to at least address. Let's see, there's a question here. Nintex workflow also provides inventory tool or PowerShell can be used. Yes, that's correct. So there's definitely a lot of different options to do that. So I mean, different tools to do that. Even some of the, and I'll touch on a little bit on migration tools as well, but some of them provide some flexibilities as well. But thanks, Gerard. And then part of your information architecture, you want to address if you do have in your environment is any custom content types and site columns, determining whether those are going to be migrated as well or need to be brought into your SharePoint Online environment. And then if you're using management data such as the term store, that too as well needs to be addressed. If you plan to bring that into to SharePoint Online, you want to make sure that are there any changes you need to make there before you bring it over into your SharePoint Online location? The other piece I have here that I think is very important is governance. And you probably should have governance, and if you don't already, for your on-prem environment. That's something that I think carries over into SharePoint Online and 365 as a whole as well, because there's a lot more that's going on in the Office 365 world, cloud world, than before, and there's so many different things that you may have to think about. Some things I list here is, for example, such as external access, external sharing, retention policies, or even DLP, policy data loss protection. These are a lot of things that come to play, and having some type of governance in place while as part of your migration is important. It definitely makes it easier, so that way you can implement the necessary policies. So some of the things I listed here, such as developing and implementing IT policies. And that could cover across all these different technologies I've listed here, like SharePoint Online, OneDrive, Teams, and Yammer. These are things that a lot of times there's some overlapping policies and settings that would work from one to the other. And so making sure you have kind of the appropriate governance around that and what you're going to be implementing right off the bat definitely would make it easier down the road. Doing it after the fact sometimes doesn't pay off, because at that point, if you may have provided more features or access and then decide to take it away, it's always usually makes it a little bit tougher for the end users to know what to expect, and that it's develop and implement security and compliance policies. So things around such as retention policies or retention labels and sensitive label and DLP policies. These are other areas within Office 365 that would affect SharePoint Online as well. And you want to make sure that if you're going to bring content in and there's a need for more security and data protection, those are things that needs to be addressed as well as part of your governance planning. And the last one here, I think is important, if you don't already have one, is making sure you have a governance committee that can review your governance plan on a more regular cadence. That could be either monthly or quarterly or something, but something that where there's a group that can determine, if there needs to be changes to your governance, and because things change, the technology changes, regulation changes, and so those may affect what type of policies or settings you may need to implement or re-implement. Okay, so a couple more things in the planning area, and so one is around migration tools. So when you migrate to SharePoint Online, it's different than migrating to another on-prem environment, like going from 2010 or 2013 SharePoint to 2016 or 19, mainly because you can't do the database method, the database attach method, if you're familiar with that. And so you're kind of resort to really, well, 1.5 ways to do it. The halfway, I think, is more of the using the manual where you can just copy content up there. That may work for small amount of content, but when you talk about in the hundreds of gigs to terabytes of data, that's just not going to fly very well. So really, your only choice is looking at a migration tool. And so I list here a few things that hopefully helps some kind of when you're looking at migration tools. One is, look at some of the common migration vendors. So I list here a few that we work with and some that you may be familiar with. Mainly, I list these guys mainly because these are the well-known ones, and these are the ones that are, a lot of organizations have used and trust. I mean, there's definitely a lot more out there as well. Not to say that they're not good or as good as these vendors, but these are the ones that definitely we have experience with, or I have experience with, or a lot of organizations I work with have experience with. So I mean, definitely the support and being well known definitely helps, because that way if there's issues, then you can contact for help. Pricing also can, in a lot of cases for these vendors, they'll do it based on how much content you're going to be migrating or how much content you're going to manage. So it fluctuates a little bit. There's some options around, and a lot of them will have the ability to negotiate a little bit as well. So, but yeah, just something to think about, because price can also determine which one works better for you. And then address necessary prerequisites are met, making sure that, as part of your migration, do you have the, the machines that would be necessary for the tool to be deployed on, making sure it has connectivity to the farm, and then also making sure that it has connectivity to your SharePoint Online tenant, some of the basic stuff, just to make sure that the tool can touch it, because these tools a lot of times are something that gets deployed on-prem. Some of these tools also have free pre-migration tools as well, to allow you to kind of test and assess your content prior to migration. It kind of gives you back some good, useful information to kind of, to give you at least an idea about, like, for example, if you have any checked out documents, or you have any, potential problems with some content, it gives you some of that information. And then some of these tools also have other features that go beyond migration too. So they may have value beyond the migration. A lot of times it's the ability to manage your SharePoint Online tenant, like around permissions, for example, or provide different types of reports. So sometimes that could also drive what type of tools you may end up getting as well. Okay, so the next part of planning I have here is definitely an important part, and this is the part that really part of the crux of migration is really the migration strategy. So I've listed here kind of a strategy that I think works pretty well for a lot of types of migration scenarios. You may tweak it or so, but a lot of times, there's things around here that hopefully gives you at least a starting point. I find it very helpful, especially for migrations, from a strategy, is to kind of have a pre-migration testing portion of your migration, mainly so you can test and make sure that you have a good performance baseline, and make sure your connectivity from wherever you're going to be migrating, is not going to be affected by other factors, or how you can address those if there are factors that's going to affect performance, because that will drive how fast or how much content you can migrate. Another piece, yes, is there a question?
Yeah, we have a question in the room from Henry.
Sure. Yes, Henry.
Hi, quick question. I noticed on the tools that you didn't have the the new Microsoft migration tool up there. And I know it's going through iterations of probably being low level to hopefully better, but any thoughts on that?
Yes. So there, to tell you the truth, I haven't used that tool that much just because of the fact, I mean, over time there were some limitations on things I needed it for. I mean, for what you need, it would probably be good from a pricing perspective because it's free. It probably addressed like the first few items, that at least bullet points I have here. The last couple are those that you won't have, and so if they're important to you, then that's kind of that's where I see it as a usage for it. I mean, the tools. It can do the job, and I think for simple migrations, that's great. But then if you're dealing with workflows and other things, it may not be sufficient enough. And so, I mean, again, I list here, these are the ones that I've dealt with a lot, and they have the features and necessity. But as with anything, you get what you pay for. It's kind of how I look at it. So if it works for you, great. But sometimes, you may need more depending on the complexity of your migration.
Thank you.
Hopefully that helps. You're welcome.
Yes.
Any other questions? Not right now.
Okay, great. All right, feel free to definitely just chime in. Okay, so I have here, so I was talking about the pre-migration. I think that's definitely an important piece. Then, part of your migration strategy is also have some type of validation script put together that's going to be used by your migration team for testing, around the access features and functionality after content has been migrated or workflows or forms are migrated, making sure that you have kind of a baseline. And then also that can also be used by your content owner, so that way they can test too, because at the end of the day, they're the one who know their content the best. So you want to make sure that they have kind of a process or a testing script that they can use as well. And then I think the last part of the migration strategy, besides the actual migration itself, is to definitely kind of involve your content owners as much as possible to create your migration strategy. So that way they understand kind of where things will fit. It may not always work, but if you have the ability to do so, then having them be involved will help to kind of see where things work. As far as it's just trying to determining where things fit, especially when you have like scenarios in the real world where the finance department, they have certain types of quarterly or certain times of the different parts of the year where they have to be where their content can't be changed or whatnot. So you want to kind of make sure you address that as well. And I find the last piece of that is around if you can stage different types of phases or waves of migration with a little bit of overlapping, that helps as well, because that way you can get one done and then get ready to start another migration, and that way you kind of have a rhythm as well. So but there's different ways you can do it. I find it to be just one of those things that doing these types of waves and planning out and working with the content owners to create the schedule is it's more, I think, pays off a little bit better in the end. Okay, so another piece with migration I find also very important is communication. That's the one thing I think to an end user is that for them to know what's going on and kind of knowing where things are happening. So I listed here some of the different stages during communication. I think that it's helpful. And again, you kind of decide where things are, but I find it like a lot of times where communication is very important is early in the project, before maybe the project even start, is to let them know that there's a coming soon type of scenario where they're going to be moving, and then prior to migration, this is kind of more tied to the content owners, in a sense to let them know that it's getting ready, and the content owners are aware, because they're going to be part of the process of your migration as well, especially around testing. And then near the end of each migration wave or so is to make sure that your content owners are also notified that they can start testing and validate for you as well. So there's these different levels of communication that's helpful to make sure that people are involved as much as possible and they are aware. And then I think one big one is definitely around prior to any like a final cutover, is to let everyone know that there's a that this is the we're about to reach the end or whatnot. And then if it makes sense, I think, and this is something I found with some clients where they like the idea of reminders, and then sending different reminders along the way as well, just kind of fillers in between to let people know, because sometimes people don't pay attention to their email or whatnot, and and getting these repeat reminders, even though it may be cumbersome possibly, but it did provide a lot of at least visibility that something's going on. And the big thing is definitely put together the actual languages of what you're going to be communicating for these different areas, these different stages, so that way you kind of know already what to expect and what the target and whatnot. So definitely planning out your communication and the actual what you're going to be saying for these different levels or stages, I think is very important. It helps definitely to make it very smooth if your users know what's going on. Okay, so we just finished through all the planning. As you can see, I put a lot of emphasis on planning because I find planning is very important. The more you plan, the better prepared you are, the better your execution for migration can go, how smoothly it can be. That's why there's so many different parts to planning. And it's sometimes, working with clients or working with, different people, like, why do we have to plan so much? Well, because you don't want to have to do it again. That's the biggest thing for me. You want to make sure you take care of it the first time and do it right. Okay, so once we get through all the planning, we look into the execution stage. And so parts of that will cover things that we kind of talked about in the planning, is now executing your communication plan itself. So that's kind of at this point, once you have all that plan set down, you have to execute those and make sure that, they're sent out at the appropriate time. And so I have here, the more your end users are informed, the more aware and willing they are to work with you prior to, during, and after migration. So I find that to be the best thing is, the more they know, the better they're going to work with you on it. Okay. And then from the migration process itself, so this is, part of that is executing the actual migration strategy that we talked about through the planning stage. And so some of the things here that I've listed to kind of help as far as to make your migration process a little bit smooth. I've always found out that if you precede your SharePoint Online tenant, that always makes it a little easier. So some of the things I have here is what I consider to be part of the preceding is the idea of building out your target site collection, having those kind of already pre-built definitely helps to kind of have where your target is going to be. Other things that might be part of the preceding is if it's part of your information architecture, would be around migrating your term store if that's something that you did use on-prem, and so that's something you want to make sure you bring in there. Same thing with your any content types and site columns. Again, those are things that if you get those kind of preceded, then you kind of have a starting point for the content migration part. Now, during the migration, definitely the big piece, especially if you have workflows, is to make sure they're either already finished or stopped, so that way you won't have some that are kind of in flight and won't finish properly when they get migrated, because there's not a way to stop it and then restart the workflow where they're at during a migration. So I think that's just something to kind of think about, especially if your users are dependent on workflows. You can also configure your migration tool to be able to connect to your SharePoint source and target. So, definitely, since your tool is your big piece of the migration process, you want to make sure it has all visibility to where it needs to be able to connect. And these last two items here I have around initial migration and remigration. I find this to be something that's actually kind of helpful. Is that if you have an initial migration wave, this allows for content owners to so-called test their content first in the new environment, so that way they can kind of see what's going on and be able to kind of give you some feedback for it. And if everything looks good, then the second, or I call the remigration portion of that, allows you then to just essentially get the differential. So that way you may not have to do the heavy lifting by remigrating everything, but just the differential, everything looks good. I find that to be kind of this two-step migration process seems to have sometimes a lot of better results. So that way you're not just dependent on one migration and then users may have problems and then you have to come back later. But if you kind of build that into your process, then that gives I think a better experience for your content owners. Okay, so after the migration is done and everything is up there, and you got the communication out, and you're getting to the end or at the end, the last big piece I think here is training. because as with anything, SharePoint Online is going to be different, very potentially. I mean, or will be with from 2013 or even 2016. And as you see, there's a lot of new things like modern pages. The modern user experience looks different. So there's definitely a lot of things that just don't look the same anymore. And so training, I think, is a big piece of what needs to be part of your plan. Either it could be technically some part of it could be during the migration, depending on how you stage it, or at maybe near the end or whatnot to kind of capture this is the new location. This is how you'll be able to look at and use their features. And so some things I've listed here are different ways that you can leverage training, different formats. Sometimes having a classroom session may work well, and having different multiples throughout a duration or time frame would help users to come and be able to ask questions. Or even making smaller versions and have like a lunch and learn that can come to that and bring their lunch and learn about some of the new things there. You can also set up webinars, for example, and have those recorded, and then people can watch that later on. Having like a one-page cheat sheet, I think, is also kind of nice too. That way they can kind of get some of how they can do certain things relatively quickly from a one-pager, for example. Also leveraging like online training services or courses may also help as well. Some of those may have some pretty good, extensive, in-depth, more training around specific techniques or features or how to do something that would be useful there. And then maybe even having a quarterly or monthly refresher course to promote new features or new functions that are coming out, because as you probably are aware, SharePoint Online has new features coming out on a pretty regular basis, and so having these refresher courses may help to to get people up to speed on some of the new things that are coming down the line as well. Okay, so I'm thinking here we're getting kind of near the end to my presentation, so I'm going to talk about a little bit about next step here. So just some things to think about now that you kind of have an idea, hopefully, about the migration process and some of the things to think about. I would say that if you're going to start to think about or do the migration, some things I put here hopefully will help to at least think about. For that, well, the first one is around put together a team that includes the business group and IT to help to kind of determine how to move to SharePoint Online. I think involving folks from from the different departments and whatnot definitely I think has a better synergy overall, because that way they can help to determine how things will go. The next one I have is determine if you plan to use other Office 365 applications such as like OneDrive for Business, Teams, and Yammer, then make sure that you kind of plan those in as well as part of your migration, because there's a chance that, definitely you want to plan them to make sure that you're leveraging the tools if they're part of your migration to put them in the appropriate place, because Teams and OneDrive definitely have a lot of similarities and infrastructure that's similar to SharePoint, and so if you're looking at that as kind of part of your initial migration, then plan for those as well. Make sure you allocate enough time to do the migration, and whether there should be multiple phases. So essentially, you want to kind of really plan out that you have enough. So if you're going to start, that's kind of more of a experience thing. Is like, if you're going to plan a migration and you have terabytes of data, you probably don't want to start that near the end of the year unless especially when there's like a lot of holidays and different time where people are on vacation. So just making sure when you start that is important. And the last one here I find more of like, well, if this is daunting to you, and a lot of things with migration, definitely there's a lot of pieces. I've done quite a few in my time, and sometimes doing it yourself is a lot, is really daunting. So it doesn't hurt to bring a partner and help you with that, because sometimes bringing someone with experience to provide you the guidance and kind of the direction is also it's a good thing, because that way it saves you on making mistakes as well. So Eric, are we good on time, or?
I think we're right at the 45-minute mark. Does anyone have any questions for Andrew? Maybe we have a couple, looks like.
Migrating Power Pivot Excel services to the cloud, and I know we've got Power BI as our alternative, but what type of challenges have you run into with going from on-prem Power Pivot Excel services, where a lot of data and reports are, and then getting that into the cloud? Or does that need to remain in a hybrid environment?
That's a good question. So it depends on if you are willing to switch to like Power BI. I think then that would be part of your planning. If it was where it's a lot of complexity there, I would, yeah, I mean, what you mentioned about hybrid actually is it's something I may talk here in a moment. We have a little bit of time, but yeah, I think hybrid may make sense in some cases depending on how much complexity and then how long you need to potentially even to do a redevelopment of that. So that's a great point. It's just one of the things, yeah, part of your plan, part of the testing as well. Some features may work, but not quite all. So in those cases, if it turns out from a testing perspective, from initial migration, you're testing it out to see the functions are there. It may not be sufficient. Then the hybrid may be a scenario where you would have that. I have that with clients where even with their workflows or InfoPath, where they're just a little complex and it takes a little more time. So having a hybrid scenario may make sense for them to allow them time to still keep their process and their business working while looking to redevelop that into something different in the cloud.
What about the data connections for those?
The data you would have in those cases. I mean, you would probably have to set up like a data gateway for the connections if you're looking to do that.
Would that be better than moving into an Azure database, or?
Oh, that depends. If you have Azure, then yeah. I mean, if you could go to Azure with that, then sure. Yeah, I would say that would be an option. So it kind of depends if you have if Azure like infrastructure IaaS is something you have in your environment, then that could be definitely a place to move it there, at least as a point in time.
So Andrew and I are both consultants, right? So it depends.
Yeah.
It's always the answer.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Like, there's a lot of possibilities. So giving you an answer one way doesn't necessarily mean that's. And I don't want to get, I guess, cornered into one answer because it could change depending on other scenarios or other situations you may have.
We've got a follow-up.
Yeah, well, just
sure.
One of the things that I recognize right off is any modifications you've made through even central admin where you're changing the 5,000 views to 20,000 items that you can put in a view. That all has to go away. You've got to plan ahead for contact any list that's running close to 5,000 and say this needs to change, and you're not going to get the same view that you had now with this. So I was one comment. The other thing is manage paths. Since you're limited, if you've been doing that, a lot of that in SharePoint on-prem, you don't have that option really the same way in the.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. There's a lot of things that's why I think part of the planning is, do some testing with content, make sure that it gives you a similar layer and determine whether or not it may work. I mean, there's definitely these limits. A lot of the limits you're talking about, like 5,000 views, a lot of those are still in place even on SharePoint Online. So you kind of have to look at are there different ways I can leverage that, or maybe this is the way. Maybe as part of this migration, I can look at re-architecting or restructuring my content as well a little bit. But yeah, those are definitely valid points to think about. Planning is important, and I think part of that is doing some testing as well. Any other questions?
David?
Yes, just a question about modern views. And when you migrate, do you migrate classic to classic and then later start moving people over to modern?
Great question. I think, Eric, you may have a good answer for that, but I'm going to give at least for mine. It depends. Again, it's really
That's what I was going to say.
But so I would say it depends on your user base and how if you think they're ready to switch or you feel like they're ready to, if you're migrating over and go to a modern view versus classic. So it kind of is what you think your user base, and that could come from discussion with the user if they're like willing to start switching, or they are they're comfortable with where they're at. They don't want to switch yet, but over time, once they get used to it, maybe they, and so that's kind of part of the trade-off you may have to build into your migrations. Like, okay, well, we'll migrate it, but we'll keep it as is as much as possible because that's what your customer, your user base is comfortable with. They don't want a huge switch in the look and feel quite yet. So that's part of the decision making as well, part of your planning.
And I can add to that a little bit here. With a lot of our customers, we're avoiding the word migration because we have customers that are on SharePoint Online now. And we're helping them transition to the modern experience from the classic experience. So you can say migration, but that's a scary word. It means a lot. It means I got to move my data, I got to restructure things. But if you're already in SharePoint Online and you've been working in the classic experience with like the publishing pages, publishing infrastructure, that kind of stuff, we are currently helping our customers transition to modern. So there's no migration. Your data stays where it's at. What you do is you have a classic page with a web part on it showing some content, let's say. What you would do is you would create a modern page at a different URL for now, right? And then you would build that modern page out to be as close to the classic page and its functionality as possible. And then at some point, once that's vetted and life is good, you just make the switch. You could just swap the URLs out if you need to, or whatever the case may be. But it's going from an on-prem to online, that's a consideration, right? So should I build my modern pages and migrate the content, then rebuild? Because when you create a page is a page without any content, right? You move your content, and now your content's in those other lists. Now you have to actually add it to those modern pages too. So it's like an extra step. It's extra effort, right? Whereas if you can just migrate from on-prem to online and keep the classic stuff for now, that's probably going to be less of a headache because the classic experience is still there. It's not gone away. Some things are interesting. Microsoft made a change a few weeks ago that caused the user profile flyout panel to not be visible. It was behind and underneath everything. And they've also been changing the way their anchor tags are behaving. If you have an anchor tag without an href attribute, that was causing multiple windows and things to open up because Microsoft made some change on their side. We actually had to open a ticket with Microsoft on the profile panel issue, and they said it was us. They said it was something we were doing in Fuse, and when we tracked it down, I was able to reproduce it by creating a brand new site collection, and I turned on publishing. Turning on publishing features with no customizations whatsoever, nothing about Fuse, nothing we were doing, nothing behind the scenes. Like this was a different environment altogether. Turned publishing on, and then this issue arose. So we had to kind of say, not us, not us.
Yeah.
But I think
Very
there's
true.
a story there from, do you transition the environment as is, and then the pages? It depends on what's going to work best. Depends.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Eric, for that. Yeah, so I mean, it's as with most things, it's all part of your planning. Is if you're going to be switching things, then you want to plan and account for that into your, in your migration and part of that. And sometimes it could be one of those things that if you have a deadline or you're trying to get to, and it's really around, well, we want to keep things as much as is, and that's kind of what drives that. But if you have time in there for redevelopment, converting and changing things, then that's great. But not every organization has that ability because they have budget timelines or whatever that's driving why they're migrating, or license renewal, for example. Those are things that would drive that, and so those could be later phases. So like what Eric mentioned about converting from classic to the modern, that could be a phase 2 in the getting after the migration is done, the bulk, and then switching it over. So definitely there's a lot of things you want to think about. Some things you can do during your migration, some things you may want to do later. So there's always a phase. I always look at everything with migration is that there's a phase 2, phase 3, or whatever, because you can't do it all in one phase, because if you did, you never get it done. So that's kind of the scenario that we run into.
Another question that's in the chat here from Gerard is, since Excel services are now online, could they migrate separately and ahead of time?
I would say you could. I'll have to double check that, but I think so. I mean, the content, if you're talking about within your Excel, then, well, let me think. I'm not sure if you
I
maybe
mean,
can you clarify that a little bit about what you want to do separately, Gerard? Oh,
And
did we
Gerard, if you're
lose?
on, feel free to come off mute and
Yes, yeah. Well, no, I was responding to somebody else's question
Oh,
about
okay.
their Excel services content, and I was just thinking that since Excel services is now online, if you were to either parallel or do that as kind of a separate activity, depending on how integrated your content is, um, then you could almost approach it as a separate migration.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, you can definitely do that. I mean, with a lot of things, you can break it up into smaller migrations if need be, just to kind of address some of these other things you may have that's a little more complex, like the Excel services. So yeah, that would definitely, I think you can do that. Yeah, that should
yeah.
not be a problem.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for the suggestion.
Sure. Uh, any other questions before? I have a little bonus part, unless you've
And
yeah,
finished.
we've got one in
how
the room
about
here.
the
Okay.
archival strategy whenever we are moving to SPO?
Is somebody online asking a question?
Yeah, I'm just asking about the archival strategy.
Oh yeah, so there's a Mark. Let me come back to you.
Yeah, sure.
There's a question in the chat here about archival strategy. How can we set up an archival strategy for SharePoint Online if we would like to move data?
Okay. Are you talking about like moving data like after this is like post migration and you're looking to have data
Yeah,
be
yeah, yeah,
migrated or moved
yeah.
off like archival? Yeah, I mean,
I
I
mean,
guess ways to do that is a lot of times we have
still do we have to use the record center or document center to
oh,
keep
you mean
the
like the content
record?
organizer and stuff? No,
Yeah, yeah,
you can use other things like the like Flow, for example, if you want to use that as a way to archive or move content, it's using the workflow mechanism. Usually, I mean,
yeah,
that's what content organizer kind of does too as well.
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we would like to keep everything on SharePoint Online, and we don't want it to touch couple of, gigs of data. So we would like to keep it somewhere as a storage, so that in later point of view to can, we can use it as for audits and all. So in that
Okay,
particular,
yeah. Well, if you're going to keep it within SharePoint archive, it would be one of those things that you can yeah use some mechanism to move it to another like dedicated site collection for archive. I don't know. It sounds like maybe you also may be talking about backups as well. If you're looking to like back up the content so that way you have that somewhere else. I mean, there's definitely tools or services out there that provide abilities to kind of tap into SharePoint Online, for example, and back that to a alternate location that's outside of Office 365 as well. So that may be an option if you're looking to kind of protect the data in case something goes wrong with it, then you have a copy somewhere else. So the backup option is one. The archiving would be more of like leveraging like say some type of workflow mechanism to do that. To move it to like another dedicated site collection for archival purposes. Hopefully that answered your question.
I heard somebody drop, so
Okay.
we may have lost him.
Okay. Okay. Let
Let's
me move
do,
to the last. Or did you want to go? Eric?
let's do one more question, and then I know you got to get
Okay.
going, Andrew. Mark?
Sure.
When preceding your site collections, and you're doing a classic experience, so you've got some custom site templates that you're using with branding and so forth. Is that would you recommend doing that before or after applying those afterwards?
Oh, well, Eric, are you about to say something?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Okay.
I can elaborate, but
Well, actually, once you speak on it, Eric, you're probably more versed in that. You probably have a better
okay.
answer
Yeah,
than
I can
do.
give it a shot. So the question is if you have a site that's already got branding applied to it?
Well, they're custom templates, but you're not moving the templates. As part of the migration strategy, you would have to build those and apply them across the site collection, basically.
And when you say template, what are
So it's custom branded templates.
okay?
Oh,
So
like a
are
team
we
site
talking about like
template that's
the,
customized.
Yeah, like your pages, your custom pages, and so forth that you have.
so as far as the migration would be concerned, from going from on-prem to online,
the Muse publishing.
Do you want me to answer that? Or
So
Tony?
so what we did with Fuse is we've got several custom page layouts that we use, and so we have a PowerShell script that we run that takes all the custom page layouts, dumps them in that environment, make sure they're associated with the right content type and all the fields are there and all that good stuff, and then we provision the pages based on those. Does that help?
And I would say from a migration perspective, if you have custom templates, so there's a couple ways to look at it. One is you would probably want to do it before or after. Kind of depends again on on the strategy for that. But I would say, during the migration process itself, if it's custom templates and they don't exist in SharePoint Online, then they'll default to one of the existing templates that are out there. So if you want to look at it that way, if you are to bury those, so I would say then at that point, if you're needing to keep that custom template or something similar to that, then you probably want to have that part of your preceding to have that ready, so that way you can then map it using the migration tool, because then the migration tool can be used to then associate your template to the other template in SharePoint Online for as part of the migration. So I think that would be kind of the scenario I would look at, is if you are needing to keep it or something like that, then you want to create the necessary custom template beforehand, and then your migration can then accommodate for that.
Thanks.
Sure.
Cool. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I'm going to move to the very last. This should be a real quick one, and just this little bonus hybrid model. I think there was a question for that or so, or at least that's what Eric told me. So if he's lying, then sorry. I'll feed here real quickly. So around the hybrid model, and I know we mentioned this a little bit, or someone asked a question about that. So yeah, definitely the option around hybrid is a possibility with 2013, 16, and 19. So using a hybrid, and so some organizations have a need for that. I have one client where they're a bank, and they're going all cloud, except they're a little bit hesitant about not having something on-prem to put a hybrid with, because of the fact that they may have some departments or some vice president, groups that have something that just they're not quite ready to go to the cloud. So in their case, there's a need for that, regardless of whatever it is, but the perception is that they have a need for it. So if you do go at a hybrid, these are just some of the features that you would have access to. I mean, there's definitely a lot more, but I just listed some of the more of the highlighted ones that may be of interest. One that definitely is a first hybrid that came out early on was the ability to do a hybrid search. There's a couple ways to do the hybrid search here. I listed a couple. One is called like a federated search, and the other is the cloud hybrid. The federated search kind of allows for the ability to pull your SharePoint Online search results down to your on-prem, and so that way the searching mechanisms are kind of still kept separate, but you're able to at least surface that information on-prem, for example. The other one is the cloud hybrid search, and that actually essentially you're sitting everything up into SharePoint Online to their search service app and let it do all the work there. So all your on-prem stuff gets pushed up there, and it does work, and then allow you, the results come back, and the work is actually done by by SharePoint Online instead. Another hybrid that's kind of very helpful, and it's one of the early on, is essentially leveraging OneDrive for Business in the cloud or in Office 365, and still using your SharePoint on-prem. So users, when they click on About Me or accessing their OneDrive from an on-prem version of SharePoint, it redirects them up to their OneDrive in Office 365. So that's kind of at one point Microsoft was using it, and I think they may still, as a way to kind of get your foot to dip into Office 365 without going full Office 365 with SharePoint. So that kind of was a way to do that, and that's gives you that kind of the hybrid where OneDrive is not on your on-prem environment at all. There's also hybrid auditing, ability to push the audit logs and stuff up into Office 365 to have it processed there. There's also this hybrid taxonomy and content type. It allows for like kind of a shared taxonomy, a term store and content type where it's being managed in SharePoint Online. And then you can see that information in your on-prem version of SharePoint as well. And I have a link down here that kind of shows some of the new hybrid model features that are available. And there's quite a few other ones as well. But these are some of the high, I think, that are more visible. Hybrid definitely is a very functional way to do things. And so if it works, if it's a need for you, and it could be one of those where if your search or your migration may go over more than a couple years or so, maybe a hybrid might be the way to go, at least for the temporary until you finally go full cloud or whatnot. But definitely there's options to do that with 2013, 16, and 19. So that's really all I have. So Eric, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Sure. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions here in the chat real quick.
Okay.
If you have a few more minutes, I don't want to keep you too long.
Sure, that's fine. What are the questions?
So let's see here. So Gerard, earlier talking about templates, comment is don't recommend reusing any existing templates. Ideally, rebuild them in the new environment prior to migration, which I think is good advice.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I guess I was a little, maybe I didn't say it correctly, is that if you're gonna you wouldn't bring over any customized temp because it's gonna be as part of the migration. A lot of times the tools won't do that, but yeah, as a part of what you would do if you were to create a new template or so, customized in your SharePoint Online, then you can use that as kind of the target way to send your like your web page customized one over to this new customized. But yeah, there's two at that point. This template is another template, but it's one that's going to be hopefully more comparable or closer to what you had on your on-prem version.
And then it was just a quick comment I wanted to visit, but Gerard's got a question here. What are the business process tools that can be used in hybrid config so that content can be accessed between on-prem and the cloud?
Well, interesting enough, you can do Flow is one that allows for the connection to your on-prem. So I think it works. I believe it does work all the way down to 2013 to have Flow be one of the business process that would work with your SharePoint on-prem, which is great because I think prior to SharePoint 2019 release that wasn't possible quite yet, and since then I think now you have the ability to leverage Flow in your on-prem as well. I think that's what you were asking, right, Gerard? Hopefully.
I think Power Apps does too, right?
Yeah, I think Power Apps as well. Yeah, I didn't want to quite say because I was 100% sure, but I think that
it's like you can't have Power Apps without Flow and Flow without Power Apps.
Well, you could technically, but
but I mean.
But doesn't Power Apps have limited application in SharePoint 2013?
Well, yeah, it kind of depends on how you use Power Apps. If you use it as kind of like an interface for a form, yes. But if you're using Power Apps separately as its own application, then it's more powerful. So yes,
Okay.
I think your answer, your question, yes. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah. Oh yeah, because I haven't been able to find anything up until just recently that implied that the capability was in Flow, but I'm glad that you confirmed that.
Sure. Great. Any other question, Eric?
Yeah, I have one
Okay.
out here in the Skype call.
Sure.
Would you consider then Power Apps not really to be a successor for InfoPath or a replacement in that sense?
That's a great question.
It's kind of hard to tell from the literature online, really.
Yeah, so if you talk to Microsoft, they will say yes. That's kind of how they're positioning it. But yeah, it's totally different than what InfoPath. I mean, function-wise, it's kind of from that perspective on paper it looks like that, and that's kind of how Microsoft's positioning it. But yeah, definitely Power Apps is more than what InfoPath was or is. Because InfoPath, you can do all kinds of stuff with it, but Power Apps is almost in a different level as far as it's almost a mini application because its primary focus when you kind of look at it is that it's meant to work in like mobile devices because you can create these Power Apps interfaces and it works well in the mobile space, and that's kind of where the sweet spot's at for Power Apps. But it can also work within SharePoint, and Microsoft really doesn't have anything that's like a true like one-for-one replacement to Power Apps, or excuse me, to InfoPath, and so that's their answer essentially is Power Apps. So I mean, if you're looking for something that's kind of close to what InfoPath was, I would look like maybe a third party like Nintex Forms would be the most closest thing, but with a lot more features and whatnot. But yeah, that's the answer you probably get from Microsoft is that it's their successor in their case, but it does more than what InfoPath does.
And I would say, I hate to say it because it's just getting ridiculous, but it depends.
Yeah, exactly.
I've seen some really simple InfoPath forms that can be done in Power Apps, and I've seen an InfoPath form that automates creation of Word documents and transitioning those into PDFs with signatures and crazy stuff like that. Is like, you're not going to get there with a Power App easily. You know, I mean, could be a
Yeah.
Power App in Flow, but I mean, I would look at Power Apps first, right? Because you're probably licensed for it or have it available, whereas Nintex Forms is a third party. There's cost involved, and that may not be feasible, and lots of variables there.
Yeah, exactly. It all kind of depends on what, I mean, if you have a lot of invested development in InfoPath forms. I mean, InfoPath still works in SharePoint Online. It's deprecated, but it's not gone. It will be gone at some point in the near future, and I think there was a date or something I recall seeing, like 2025 or 6 or something.
2023,
But
I think.
was it okay? Even sooner.
Because it was
So-
like in 2013 they announced they weren't going to support it anymore, and then they had the InfoPath is Dead parade at
Yep.
one of the SharePoint conferences. But it was
Yeah,
like
so you-
2023.
Yeah, and so you really have to think about, well, InfoPath still technically works, but not for very long, much longer. So you can still bring it in there. It's just in the question is your roadmap is to look at what other alternative. And so Power Apps is the closest thing that will replace InfoPath. But there's other third-party solutions out there. So it just really depends on, again, kind of where you want to end up and if Power Apps would be sufficient. If not, then that's where you start looking at other options, third-party options or whatnot. But yeah, InfoPath it's going to go away, and so knowing that you have to account for what you're going to do with that. But you still have a little bit of time, just not a lot. And it's just one of those natural progressions. Like, okay, it's going to go away, so I need to think about what I need to do with my InfoPath forms.
Thank you very much.
Sure. All right, Eric. I think at this point, I'm done. I don't want to take up more of your time because I know you have your presentation for the second part.
Sure. I'm going to go